The gunshot echoed through Devil's Canyon. It sounded like thunder trapped between stone walls, a sharp, violent crack that tore through the sighing of the wind. Inside the lonely cabin, blood dripped. It pattered a slow, steady rhythm onto the rough wooden floor. Each drop marked another second in a place where time itself seemed to have stopped cold. Outside, the wind howled through the ponderosa pines. It carried the scent of coming snow, the smell of wet earth, and something else. Something metallic and final. The smell of an ending that was also a beginning. But this story doesn't start here, with a gunshot and a cry. To understand the blood on the floor, you have to go back 3 days. Back to when the same wind carried a different sound across the high desert of Montana. The sound of 1,000 cattle on the move, and the men who drove them. Thomas McKinnon rode point. His face was a roadmap of hard miles, etched by sun and worry. At 30, he'd already burned through more lives than most men get in a lifetime. The war had stolen his youth. The frontier had taken what was left and hammered it into something hard, something that didn't break easy. The cattle drive was almost over. 6 weeks on the trail, pushing the herd from the Broken Arrow Ranch through country that would kill a man for looking at it wrong. His blue eyes, once bright with the hope of a Tennessee farm boy, were now tired. They held the deep, careful weariness of a man who knew survival was about seeing the monster in the shadows before it saw you. The canyon ahead got tight. The red sandstone walls squeezed in, rising up like the bones of the earth, reaching for a sky that was turning the color of a bad bruise. Rain was coming. Thomas could feel it in the air, a tension that mirrored the knot in his own gut. He raised a gloved hand. The signal to slow the herd rippled back through the long line of cowboys and cattle. Something was wrong. The silence was too deep, too heavy. It was a hungry kind of quiet. 15 years of driving cattle, from the heat of Texas to the cold heart of Canada, had given him an instinct. A little voice in the back of his head that screamed when things were about to go sideways. Right now, that voice was screaming bloody murder. And that's when the first arrow hit. It struck the lead steer, a big brindle bull, right between the shoulder blades. The animal let out a bellow that wasn't pain, but pure animal shock. It shattered the quiet into a million pieces. The bull stumbled, its legs folding, and the whole world seemed to hold its breath for a single, terrible second. Then the second arrow came. It whistled past Thomas's ear, so close he felt the whisper of the fletching against his skin. It was a message, personal and direct. By the time the third arrow thudded into another steer, Thomas was no longer on his horse. He was moving without thinking, a lifetime of instinct taking over. He dove from the saddle, his Winchester rifle sliding from its scabbard, the motion as smooth and practiced as breathing. He hit the ground, rolled behind a fallen log, and came up with the rifle already at his shoulder. The world exploded. The attack came from 3 sides at once. It wasn't a random raid. This was planned. This was an execution. War cries bounced off the canyon walls, a terrifying chorus that sounded like it was coming from everywhere at once. Painted warriors rose from behind rocks, from the crevices in the cliffs. They seemed to materialize out of the very ground itself, their ponies dancing on terrain that should have been impassable. Thomas counted a dozen, then more. Their faces were streaked with ochre and vermilion, patterns of war he'd never seen before. This wasn't a tribe he recognized. This was something different. Something desperate. Behind him, his men were fighting for their lives. The sharp crack of rifles mixed with the high-pitched screams of wounded horses. The cattle, already spooked, went mad. They stampeded, a wave of horns and hooves that shook the canyon floor, turning the narrow pass into a churning meat grinder of chaos and death. Thomas didn't panic. The cold part of his brain took over, the part that had seen battlefields far worse than this. He worked the lever on his Winchester, aim, squeeze, eject. The brass cartridges glittered in the dust around him. A warrior on a pinto pony went down, clutching a shattered shoulder. Another ducked behind a boulder, a spray of rock chips showing where Thomas's bullet had struck inches from his head. The rifle grew hot in his hands. The smell of burnt powder filled his nostrils. The fight felt like it lasted for hours, a lifetime compressed into minutes. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The last war cry faded, leaving only echoes. And a silence that was even worse than the noise. Thomas slowly raised his head from behind the log. The scene was a nightmare. 7 of his cowboys were down, dead or dying. The ground was littered with the bodies of cattle and horses. What was left of the proud herd was scattered and gone. The survivors, just Thomas and 3 others, were alone in a canyon that had become a graveyard. And as the first drops of the promised rain began to fall, washing the blood from the stones, he saw something that made the hairs on his neck stand up. There was movement. Up on the rocks where the attackers had been, a single figure was emerging from the shadows. It wasn't a warrior coming back to finish the job. The figure walked slowly, its hands raised, but not in a way that looked like surrender. It was a woman. She wore a buckskin dress, torn and stained. Her long black hair was matted with rain and dirt. She walked with a strange, careful dignity, like someone who knew they were walking toward their own death, but refused to be afraid of it. She was young, maybe 20. Her features were a mix of things Thomas couldn't quite place. The high cheekbones and dark, almond-shaped eyes of the Plains tribes, for sure. But there was something else in the line of her jaw, in the shape of her mouth, that spoke of white ancestry. Her skin was golden, tanned by a life under the open sky. She moved with a grace that reminded him of a deer coming to a stream at dawn. The other cowboys, what was left of them, raised their rifles. Their faces were grim, their eyes filled with hate and fear. But Thomas held up a hand. "Hold your fire." Something was off, the way she walked, the way she held her head high. This wasn't one of the attackers. She approached until she was just 10 yards away, her moccasins making no sound on the wet ground. The rain fell around her, tracing paths down her face that looked like tears. When she spoke, her voice was clear, cutting through the sound of the storm. Her English was perfect, almost formal. "The men who attacked you are gone. They are Lakota. I am Ayanna, of the Crow, and I had no part in their war." Thomas rose slowly, his Winchester still held at the ready. Of the 12 men who rode into the canyon that morning, only 4 were left standing. Charlie Brennan, the youngest, had a bloody gash on his forehead. Jake Morrison, the old veteran, had a grim set to his jaw that said he was ready to kill anything that moved. "Why in the hell should we believe you?" Charlie yelled, his voice cracking with trauma and rage. Ayanna turned her gaze on him. Her eyes were old. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much death, too much sorrow. "Because I was here the whole time, hidden. I could have put an arrow in each of your backs while you fought. Because I am still here, speaking peace, when I could have vanished into the mountains. And because I choose to believe that not all white men are like the ones who burned my village to the ground." The words hung in the rain-soaked air. Burned her village? Thomas studied her face, looking for a lie, for any sign of deception. He saw nothing but a weariness that was bone-deep, a grief that was too heavy for someone so young. "What happened to your village?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. Her expression didn't change, but he saw her hands clench into fists at her sides. It was the only sign of the storm raging inside her. 3 days ago, soldiers came. They came in the night, when the people slept. They said we were hiding warriors, that we had stolen cattle. It was a lie. We were a peaceful band. We were trying to walk the new path while honoring the old ways." She paused, her gaze drifting toward the darkening canyon walls. "They burned everything. The lodges, the food we had stored for winter, the sacred bundles passed down from our grandfathers. They shot anyone who couldn't run. I only survived because I was in the high meadows, gathering healing herbs." A cold knot formed in Thomas's stomach. He'd heard these stories before. Rumors from other trail hands, whispered tales of army units or territorial militias who didn't care about guilt or innocence. An attack on one white settlement would be avenged on the first native camp they could find. It was a dark and bloody math that never added up right. "The Lakota warriors," she continued, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "They found me yesterday. I was wandering lost. They said they would avenge my people. They said they would kill every white man they saw. I told them more blood would not wash away the blood that was already spilled. They didn't listen." So why didn't you run with him? Jake Morrison growled. The old cowboy didn't trust anything that didn't come from a bottle or the end of a gun. Ayana's eyes locked onto Thomas's. Because I am tired of death, she said. But her words were for all of them. Because I have seen what hate does. It turns good men into monsters. It poisons the soul. And I have to believe that somewhere in this broken world, there are still people who choose a different way. The rain was coming down harder now. Night was falling fast. The canyon was no place to be after dark, not with fresh bodies lying on the ground. We need shelter, Thomas said, making a decision. There's an old line shack 2 miles up this canyon. We can hole up there, figure out what to do. The others nodded. They had no choice. The nearest town was a 3-day ride, and the country between here and there was now enemy territory. As they gathered what they could salvage, a few bedrolls, some bags of coffee and beans, Thomas watched Ayana. She moved among the dead with a quiet reverence. She gently closed the eyes of the fallen cowboys. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. In the middle of all this violence, she was still holding on to a piece of her humanity. Suddenly, Charlie Brennan swayed on his feet and collapsed. The gash on his head, worse than they thought, had finally taken its toll. Before anyone could move, Ayana was at his side. Her hands were surprisingly skilled. She examined the wound with a practiced eye, then began tearing strips from the hem of her own buckskin dress to make a clean bandage. She worked with a silent, focused efficiency that was stunning to watch. "Where did you learn to do that?" Thomas asked, crouching beside her. "My grandmother was a medicine woman," she said without looking up, her fingers deftly tying off the bandage. "She taught me the healing ways. Before the soldiers came to take the children to their schools, I was allowed to stay. My father? He was a white trader. He married into my mother's tribe." That explained it. The mixed blood, the perfect English. She was a bridge between 2 worlds. A bridge that had just been burned from both ends. The line shack was a squat, ugly little thing, perched on a rise overlooking the canyon. Just 4 log walls and a leaky roof. But the stone chimney promised warmth, and right now, warmth was life. As they got closer, Thomas saw something that made his hand go to his rifle. Fresh horse tracks in the mud. Lots of them. Someone had been here. Very recently. He swung off his horse, signaling for the others to hang back. The cabin door was slightly ajar, swinging back and forth in the wind like a broken jaw. He moved toward it, his boots making sucking sounds in the mud. Jake and the wounded Charlie stayed on their horses, rifles ready. Ayana stood beside her own mount, perfectly still, a shadow in the gathering dusk. Thomas pushed the door open with the barrel of his Winchester and stepped inside. The cabin was empty. But it felt wrong. A fire had been burning in the hearth not long ago. He could feel the residual warmth from the stones, and the shelves. They were stocked to the brim. Sacks of flour, tins of coffee, dried meat. Far more than any line rider would leave behind. This wasn't just a shelter. It was a supply depot. On a rough table in the center of the room, a piece of paper was weighted down with 2 rocks. Thomas approached it slowly. The writing was scrawled in charcoal. A short, simple message. Gone to town. Back in 3 days. Help yourself. J.W. Thomas let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. J.W. Whoever he was, he understood the code of the frontier. An open door, a stocked larder for any traveler in need. "It's clear," he called out. "Someone's been here, but they're gone." As the others filed in, Ayana came with them, but she didn't relax. She stayed near the open doorway, her body tense, ready to bolt. Thomas saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the deep, hunted look. For a native woman, alone with 3 armed white men, trust wasn't just a luxury, it was a gamble with her life. Jake got a fire going. Charlie slumped into the single wooden chair, his face pale. Thomas started checking the supplies, trying to make sense of the strange abundance, when he noticed Ayana hadn't moved. She just stood there, a silent guardian at the threshold. The firelight danced across her face, highlighting the sharp lines of her cheekbones the intelligence in her dark eyes. "You don't have to stand there," he said quietly, so the others wouldn't hear. "No one's going to hurt you." She turned to look at him, and for a second, he felt like she was looking right through him, seeing every ugly thing he'd ever done. "I have learned," she said, her voice low and steady, "that a man's intentions can change with the setting of the sun. Kindness in the daylight can become a very different thing in the dark." There was no judgment in her voice, just a statement of fact, a lesson learned in the cruelest way imaginable. Thomas knew she was right. He'd seen it himself. The frontier had a way of peeling a man back to his basest instincts. "I won't let anyone hurt you," he said. The words came out before he could stop them, and he was surprised by the fierce conviction in his own voice. Ayanna studied his face for a long, silent moment. The firelight flickered in her eyes. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you make that promise? To me? My people are your enemy." Thomas didn't have an easy answer. Something about her courage in the canyon, her gentleness with Charlie, had woken up a part of him he thought had died in the war. "Maybe," he said, searching for the right words, "because I'm tired of seeing every stranger as an enemy. Maybe because I've seen enough killing to last 100 lifetimes." As if on cue, the wind outside let out a mournful howl. It rattled the window frame and sounded like the ghosts of the men who'd died that day, crying out from the darkness. The night was going to be long, and Thomas had a terrible feeling that the ghosts in the canyon were not the only thing they had to fear. The real danger was just getting started. Jake Morrison broke the tense silence. His face, a road map of wrinkles and old scars, was grim in the firelight. "We need a plan for the morning," he said, his voice a low rumble. "If that war party comes back, 3 of us ain't gonna be enough." Charlie, slumped in his chair, shifted painfully. "Maybe they're gone for good. They took a beating today." "They didn't come for a beating," Ayanna said from her spot near the fire. She had finally moved from the door, but she still kept her distance. "They didn't come for cattle either. They came for blood, and they won't leave until they have it." There was a chilling certainty in her voice. Thomas watched her, trying to read the shadows that danced across her face. "You know more than you're telling us," he said. "Who were they? Really?" Ayanna's hands, resting on her knees, tightened just for a second. "Some of them. They were from my mother's band. Before the soldiers came, they weren't killers. They were husbands, fathers." She moved closer to the fire, the flames casting her in a golden, flickering light. "One of them was my cousin. He was a gentle man. He made flutes that could make the birds stop and listen. Today, I watched him kill a man with a tomahawk. I didn't recognize his eyes." The cabin felt suddenly colder. Thomas had seen men change in the war, seen good farm boys turn into hollow-eyed killers. He knew that darkness was inside everyone, just waiting for the right key to unlock the door. "What changed him?" he asked. Ayanna stared into the flames, her eyes seeing something far away. "He had a daughter. 7 years old. She had a laugh like wind chimes. When the soldiers raided our village, she hid. They found her anyway." She didn't need to say more. The story hung in the small cabin, a suffocating weight of grief and rage. Everyone in that room understood. On the frontier, the line between man and monster was a razor's edge. Jake cleared his throat and stood up, breaking the spell. "Well, talkin' ain't fillin' our bellies. This JW fella left us beans and hardtack. Might as well eat." The simple act of making a meal felt like an act of defiance against the darkness outside. As Jake cooked, Thomas couldn't stop watching Ayanna. She moved with an unconscious grace, a quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her. Even after everything, she wasn't broken. When Jake offered her a tin plate of food, she took it with a quiet, "Thank you." She ate slowly, deliberately. Thomas realized she was probably starving. "When was the last time you ate a full meal?" he asked her. 3 days ago, she said simply. "Before the soldiers." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. While he and his men had been eating steak and drinking coffee on the trail, She'd been running for her life, surviving on roots and fear. He pushed his own plate toward her. Here. You need it more than I do. She started to protest. I cannot take. You can, and you will, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Consider it payment for helping Charlie. Their eyes met, and he saw something in her gaze shift. It wasn't just gratitude. It was a flicker of understanding, a recognition of respect. She took the plate with a small, solemn nod. As the storm outside grew wilder, they settled into a grim routine. Jake took the first watch by the single small window. Charlie dozed fitfully in his chair, and Thomas found he couldn't rest. His eyes kept being drawn to Ayanna, sitting by the fire, her profile etched in light and shadow. She was a mystery, a woman of two worlds belonging to neither, a healer in a time of killing, a peacemaker surrounded by war. You're staring, she said, her voice so soft he almost didn't hear it over the rain hammering on the roof. She didn't even look at him. I was just thinking, he said. About what? He hesitated. The truth felt too big, too raw for the small space between them. But in that cabin, surrounded by death, lies seemed like a waste of breath. About courage, he said. About what it took for you to walk down into that canyon, knowing we could have shot you on sight. About how you've lost everything, but you're still choosing peace over hate. She finally turned to look at him. Her eyes, reflecting the fire, seemed to hold a universe of sorrow and strength. Hope is all I have left, she said. Without it, I am no different than my cousin. Just another ghost haunted by rage. What were you? He asked. Before you were a ghost? For the first time, a small, sad smile touched her lips. I was going to be a teacher. My father had arranged for me to go to a school in Denver. I was going to learn the white man's ways of teaching and bring them back to my people, to help them understand this new world. Her smile faded. I wanted to build a bridge. The dream was so pure, so beautiful. It was heartbreaking. In a land being torn apart by violence, she had wanted to build a bridge. Now, all that was left were the ashes. Maybe you still can, he said softly. No, she whispered, the hope finally flickering in her eyes. Things will never be the same. There's too much blood in the soil now. The storm outside hit its peak. The wind screamed like a banshee. Lightning flashed, a brilliant, strobing white light that bleached the world of color for a split second. And in that flash, Thomas saw it. Movement. Outside the window. Just a flicker. It could have been a branch. But his gut screamed otherwise. He caught Jake's eye and gave a slight nod toward the window. The old cowboy had seen it too. He was already melting back into the shadows, his rifle coming up, all his earlier bluster gone, replaced by the cold focus of a predator. What is it? Charlie mumbled, half asleep. Quiet, Thomas hissed. He moved to the far wall, positioning himself to cover the door. His Winchester felt solid and heavy in his hands. An old, deadly friend. By the fire, Ayanna hadn't moved a muscle. But she was no longer looking into the flames. Her head was cocked, listening. Her entire body was a coiled spring of tension. She had sensed it too. Another flash of lightning. This time there was no mistake. 3 figures, moving low and fast through the trees. They were using the storm for cover. Even in that brief, hellish light, he saw the streaks of war paint on their faces, washed by the rain. The Lakota. They had come back. How many? Jake whispered, his voice a dry rasp. 3 that I see, Thomas breathed. Could be more. His heart hammered against his ribs. This wasn't the open canyon. This was a tiny box. A kill box. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to maneuver. This would be close and bloody. Suddenly, Ayanna stood up. She moved like a phantom toward the ladder leading to the small sleeping loft. She was trying to find a hiding place, a way out. Wait, Thomas whispered urgently. She paused, looking back at him. Her eyes were huge and dark in the firelight. They're here for me, she said, her voice shaking for the first time. As much as for you. If I give myself up, maybe they'll let you live." "Like hell they will," Jake growled from the window. "Those boys ain't here for a parley." He was right. But Thomas saw the desperate courage in her offer. She was willing to sacrifice herself to save them. It made him even more determined to protect her. "Nobody is surrendering," he said, his voice hard as iron. "We fight this together. Or we die together." Before another word could be spoken, an arrow slammed into the cabin door. It hit with a solid thwack, the iron point burying itself deep in the wood. It was a message, a declaration. Then a voice called out from the darkness, speaking in a language Thomas didn't understand. The words were harsh, guttural, a demand. Ayana's face went white. She began to tremble. "What did he say?" Thomas demanded. She translated in a choked whisper. "He says they know the white killers are inside, and they know the crow woman who betrayed her people is here. He says they will burn us out, burn the cabin to the ground with us in it." It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. But as Thomas looked at Ayana's terrified face, he realized something else. The voice wasn't just any warrior. "That's him, isn't it?" Thomas said, his own voice low. "Your cousin." She could only nod, a single jerky movement. A tear finally escaped and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. The man who used to carve flutes was outside, ready to burn her alive. And then they heard a new sound, a scraping, shuffling noise. It was coming from the roof. They were tired of waiting. The attack was coming. Not through the door, not through the window. From above. Thomas aimed his rifle at the ceiling. Jake did the same. Charlie, weak as he was, struggled to his feet, holding a pistol with a trembling hand. The cabin was silent except for the storm, their ragged breathing, and the sound of their own hearts pounding like war drums. The ceiling above the fireplace exploded downward. A warrior dropped through the hole, landing in a shower of soot and embers from the chimney. At the exact same instant, the window shattered inward, and a second attacker came tumbling through. The door, the one with the arrow in it, was kicked from its hinges with a crack of splintering wood, and a third warrior filled the space, a tomahawk gleaming in his hand. It was a perfectly coordinated assault, a wave of violence that filled the tiny cabin in a heartbeat. Thomas's rifle roared. The warrior in the fireplace was thrown backward by the impact, his body slumping into the stone hearth. From the other side of the room, Jake's gun boomed, and the man from the window dropped like a stone. But the third warrior, the one at the door, was a blur of motion. He was the biggest of the three, and he moved with a terrifying speed. He lunged past Thomas, straight for the weakest target, Charlie Brennan. The young cowboy tried to raise his pistol, but he was too slow, too hurt. The tomahawk swung in a glittering arc. Thomas didn't have a clear shot. He didn't have time. He reversed his rifle, gripping it like a club, and swung the heavy steel buttplate with all his strength into the warrior's side. He felt ribs crack under the blow. The warrior grunted, stumbling, but he didn't go down. He was fueled by a rage that went beyond pain. He spun, turning his attention to Thomas, his eyes burning with a pure, homicidal fire. The tomahawk whistled past Thomas's head, missing by a whisper, and bit deep into the log wall behind him. For a split second, the warrior was off balance, his weapon stuck. It was the only opening Thomas would get. He drove his knee hard into the man's stomach, then brought the rifle butt down on the back of his skull. The fight was over. Silence fell. A thick, heavy silence, broken only by the whimpering of the wind and the drip of rain through the new hole in the roof. 3 bodies lay on the floor. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Jake moved to the broken window, peering out into the storm. "Is that all of them?" "I don't know," Thomas said, reloading his Winchester with shaking hands. And then they heard it. Horses. Not approaching, but circling. Moving through the trees just beyond the firelight. They hadn't sent everyone in. The first wave was just a test, a way to soften them up. The others were still out there, waiting. Ayana stepped out of the shadows of the loft ladder. She had been there the whole time, a silent witness to the carnage. Her face was a mask of shock, But her voice, when she spoke, was eerily calm. "When they found me in the mountains," she said, "there were 8 of them." Thomas did the grim math. 3 are dead here. That means 5 are still out there. 5 warriors, against 2 able-bodied cowboys, 1 badly wounded, and 1 woman who knew how to bandage a wound but not fire a gun. The odds were impossible. They were trapped, surrounded, and their ammunition was running low. As Thomas looked at the determined faces of his friends and the quiet, terrified courage in Ayanna's eyes, he knew one thing for sure. Dawn was a long way off, and it was very unlikely they would all live to see it. The hours that followed were the longest of Thomas's life. The remaining warriors didn't rush them. They were smart. They settled in for a siege, content to let the storm and the creeping fear do their work for them. They would let exhaustion set in, let the defenders' nerves fray, let their ammunition dwindle. Time was their greatest weapon. Inside the cabin, the tension was a physical thing. It was thick and suffocating. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Charlie Brennan was fading fast. He was slumped against the wall, his breathing shallow. Ayanna was by his side, doing what she could, tearing more strips from her dress to keep his wounds clean, giving him sips of water. She was a beacon of calm in the middle of the chaos, her hands gentle and sure. But Thomas could see the strain in her eyes. She was just a girl, holding back an ocean of death with nothing but herbs and scraps of cloth. Jake kept watch at the window, his old face set like granite. But even he was starting to show the wear. His movements were slower, his eyes were heavy-lidded. They were all running on fumes. Thomas found himself unable to stay still. He paced the small cabin like a caged animal, his rifle never leaving his hands. He checked their ammunition again. 6 rounds for his Winchester. Jake had maybe 10 for his. Charlie's pistol was empty. It wasn't nearly enough. He kept looking at Ayanna, at the quiet strength she projected. She seemed to carry a light inside her that the darkness couldn't touch. "You should try to rest," she said to him, her voice a soft murmur. "You'll need your strength." "I can't rest," he growled. "Not while they're out there." She finished adjusting Charlie's bandage and rose, moving to stand near him by the shattered door. The storm had lessened slightly, and the fire cast a warm, hypnotic glow. She was so close he could smell the scent of pine and rain in her hair. "My grandmother used to tell stories," she said, her eyes on the fire. "Stories of heroes. In every story there was a moment when the hero had to make a choice. Not between fighting and running, but between fear and faith. And that choice decided everything." He looked down at her, at the firelight playing on her face. "What choice do you think I have?" Before she could answer, a new sound cut through the night. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the cautious movement of warriors. It was the heavy, rhythmic drumming of multiple horses, moving fast, coming up the canyon. Jake flattened himself against the wall. "Riders!" he hissed. "Coming hard! Maybe 6, 7 of them!" Thomas's blood ran cold. Reinforcements. The war party had sent for help. It was over. They were all going to die here, in this forgotten cabin at the edge of the world. He moved to the window next to Jake, raising his Winchester for one last hopeless stand. Just then, a bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating the canyon in a flash of brilliant, ghostly light. He saw the riders clearly, a full squad of them, galloping toward the cabin. But they weren't warriors. They were wearing dark blue uniforms. They were carrying army-issue carbines. Their hats were pulled low against the rain. They were soldiers. "Cavalry," Thomas breathed, not daring to believe it. "It's the cavalry." The arrival of the patrol was like a miracle. The remaining Lakota warriors, seeing the overwhelming numbers, vanished into the forest like smoke. 1 minute they were a deadly threat. The next they were gone. The siege was broken. They were saved. Or so Thomas thought. The officer in command was a captain named Harrison. He was a hard-faced man with cold, calculating eyes. He listened without expression as Thomas explained what had happened. The ambush, the fight, taking refuge in the cabin. But when Thomas mentioned Ayanna and what she had told them about her village being destroyed by soldiers, the captain's expression hardened. "We've been hunting that war party for 3 days," Harrison said, his voice flat. "They hit a supply wagon, killed 4 men. We lost their trail in the storm and decided to check the line shacks. It all sounded right. It all sounded like a rescue, but Thomas felt a prickle of unease. The way Harrison looked at Ayanna wasn't right. It wasn't the look of an officer seeing a victim. It was the look of a man finding a problem he thought he'd already solved. "The woman," Harrison said, his gaze fixed on Ayanna. "She was with them." "No," Thomas said sharply. "She was their prisoner. She saved our lives." Harrison's face was a mask of disbelief. A Crow woman helping white men against the Lakota? That's a new one. The skepticism in his voice was thick. He didn't believe a word of it. As the gray light of dawn finally crept into the canyon, Captain Harrison made his decision. "We'll escort you and your men to town," he said, the words carrying the full weight of military authority. Then he looked straight at Ayanna. "She comes with us, to the fort, for questioning." "Questioning about what?" Thomas demanded, stepping in front of Ayanna protectively. "She's the victim here." "She's a material witness," Harrison snapped. "She admits to knowing the hostiles. That makes her an accomplice until proven otherwise. She's coming with us." Rage, hot and blinding, surged through Thomas. After everything she had endured, after the courage she had shown, this man was going to treat her like a criminal, just because of who she was. The sheer injustice of it was a bitter pill. "I won't let you take her." The words were quiet, but they landed like a thunderclap. Every soldier, every cowboy stopped what they were doing and stared. Captain Harrison's face turned a dangerous shade of red. He was not a man who liked being challenged. "You won't let me?" he sneered. "Cowboy, you seem to be forgetting who's in charge here. That is a direct order." He gestured to 2 of his soldiers. "Take her." Thomas didn't move. He just stood there, a simple cattleman blocking the path of the United States Army. In his mind, he saw her tending to Charlie, saw her offering to sacrifice herself, saw the flicker of hope in her eyes when he'd shown her a small kindness. He would die before he let them put her in chains. "She's under my protection," he said, his voice level. "Your protection means nothing," Harrison barked. "Now stand aside, or I'll have you arrested for interfering with a military operation." What happened next was madness. Jake Morrison, the grizzled old cynic, stepped up beside Thomas, his rifle held loosely, but ready. On his other side, Charlie Brennan, pale and bleeding, pushed himself off the wall and raised his empty pistol, his young face set in a look of grim defiance. 3 exhausted wounded cowboys against a squad of cavalry. It was suicide. The soldiers raised their carbines. The clearing around the cabin became a tinderbox waiting for a spark. And then Ayanna moved. She stepped out from behind Thomas, her head held high. Her face was calm, her dignity a shield that no weapon could pierce. She spoke directly to Captain Harrison, her voice clear and strong. "I will go with you," she said, willingly. "I will not be the cause of more bloodshed." Harrison looked surprised, his anger momentarily forgotten. "But not as a prisoner," she continued, her dark eyes flashing. "And on one condition." The captain was taken aback by her audacity. "You're in no position to make conditions." "My condition is this," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "These men are to be allowed to go free, without any trouble. And I ask for one more thing." She turned her gaze to Thomas, and what he saw in her eyes stole his breath. It was trust, absolute and complete. "I ask that this man, Thomas McKinnon, be allowed to come with me to the fort, to speak for me, as my advocate." The request was insane, unheard of. An Indian prisoner demanding a white cowboy as her lawyer. Harrison was speechless for a moment. "That is highly irregular." "Many things about this day have been irregular, Captain," Ayanna said. "But if you are a man of justice, and not just a man of vengeance, you will grant it." Harrison stared at her, then at Thomas, then back at her. He was trapped by her words, by her courage. In front of his own men, he couldn't refuse without looking like a tyrant. "Very well," he finally ground out, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "But make no mistake. The fort commander will have the final say, and he is not a sentimental man." As they rode out of the canyon, leaving the dead behind, Thomas found himself riding beside Ayanna. The sun was up now, but it brought no warmth. A new and more dangerous chapter had begun. "Why did you do it?" she asked him, her voice quiet. "Risk everything for me?" He thought for a long moment, watching the rigid backs of the soldiers in front of them. "Because," he said, the truth of it finally settling into his own heart, "in all this madness, in all this hate, you're the first thing that's made sense. You chose hope when everyone else chose a gun." He hesitated, then plunged ahead. "Because I think I'm falling in love with you." The words hung between them, fragile and powerful. He hadn't known he was going to say them, but now that they were out, he knew they were true. She turned to look at him, and for the first time since he'd met her, he saw tears welling in her eyes. "I have nothing," she whispered. "My home is gone. My people are scattered. My future is a prison cell, or worse. I have nothing left to give anyone." "Then we'll start with nothing," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "Together." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but behind the tears, for the first time, he saw not just hope, but the faintest glimmer of a new beginning. But as they rode toward the fort, Thomas couldn't shake a terrifying thought. Captain Harrison hadn't been angry when Ayanna demanded an advocate. He'd been relieved. It was almost as if she had given him exactly what he wanted. A way to get both of the only living witnesses to his crimes under his control in a place where they could be silenced. Permanently. The rescue wasn't a rescue. It was a capture, and they were riding willingly into the lion's den. The ride to Fort Harrison was a silent, grim affair. The soldiers treated them not as rescued civilians, but as prisoners. Every time Thomas tried to speak to Ayanna, a trooper would ride between them, his face a stony mask. Captain Harrison rode at the head of the column, a rigid, imposing figure who never once looked back. Thomas's mind was racing. Harrison's reaction to Ayanna's story, his insistence on taking her, the way his eyes held a cold, predatory light. It didn't add up. This wasn't a soldier doing his duty. This was a man covering his tracks. The attack on her village wasn't a mistake or a tragedy of war. It was a deliberate act. But why? They left Jake and the wounded Charlie at the dusty little settlement of Three Forks, with a promise from Harrison that a doctor would be sent for. The old cowboy gave Thomas a long, hard look before they parted. "You watch your back, son," he'd muttered. "That captain's got the eyes of a snake." As Thomas and Ayanna rode through the gates of the fort, a sprawling complex of log buildings surrounded by a high stockade, a feeling of dread settled over him. This wasn't a place of justice. It was a cage. They were separated immediately. Ayanna was led to a small, windowless building that served as the stockade. Thomas was escorted to the commander's office, a slightly larger cabin distinguished only by the flag hanging limply from a pole out front. The commander was a Colonel Davenport, a man whose face seemed to be permanently fixed in a scowl. He was old, with graying sideburns and a uniform that was too tight across his belly. He listened to Captain Harrison's report, which was a masterful piece of fiction. In Harrison's telling, they'd heroically rescued the cowboys from a savage attack and captured a hostile squaw who was clearly in league with the warriors. Thomas was merely a civilian witness who had been unsettled by his ordeal. "And this man," Harrison finished, gesturing to Thomas with contempt, "has the absurd notion that he should act as the squaw's advocate." Colonel Davenport peered at Thomas over a pair of spectacles. "An advocate? This is a military tribunal, Mr. McKinnon, not a courtroom drama. The woman is an enemy combatant. She has no rights here." "She's not an enemy combatant," Thomas said, his voice level despite the anger boiling inside him. "She's a survivor of a massacre perpetrated by soldiers of this army. Soldiers led by Captain Harrison." The air in the room went still. Harrison's face paled, then flushed with fury. "That is a slanderous lie." "Is it?" Thomas pressed, seeing a flicker of uncertainty in the colonel's eyes. "Then why were you so eager to bring her here? Why not let her go, unless you were afraid of what she might say? Afraid she was a loose end you needed to tie up?" "Colonel, this man is delirious," Harrison began. "Enough!" Davenport roared, slamming his hand on his desk. He looked from Harrison's furious face to Thomas's determined one. "Captain, your report is noted. Mr. McKinnon, your accusations are noted as well. I will question the woman myself. In the meantime, you will be confined to quarters. You are not to leave the fort." Thomas was escorted to a small, dusty barracks room. The door was locked behind him. He was a prisoner as much as Ayanna was. He paced the small space, his mind a whirlwind of fear and frustration. He had walked right into Harrison's trap. Now they were both at the captain's mercy, and he suspected Harrison didn't have any. Hours turned into a day, then 2. Food was brought to his room, but no one would speak to him. He could hear the sounds of the fort outside, the bugle calls, the marching of troops, the shouts of men. It was the sound of his prison walls. He had no idea what was happening to Ayanna. Was she even still alive? On the evening of the second day, the lock on his door scraped open. It wasn't a guard. It was a young lieutenant, a man so new to the army that his uniform still looked stiff. His face was pale, and he looked terrified. "Mr. McKinnon," the lieutenant whispered, darting nervous glances down the hallway. "You have to listen to me. I was on the patrol with Captain Harrison, the one to the Crow village." Thomas froze, his heart pounding. "What happened?" "It wasn't right," the young man stammered, his voice cracking. "The orders were to scout, to observe. But the captain, he told us they were harboring the warriors who hit the supply wagon. He ordered us to attack. We did things. The colonel doesn't know. Harrison lied in his report. He said we were fired on first." "Why are you telling me this?" Thomas asked, his voice low and urgent. "Because of the woman," the lieutenant said. "I heard Harrison talking to the sergeant. They're moving her tonight. They're not taking her to the stockade. They're taking her for a walk. That's what he said. Everyone knows what that means. They're going to kill her. And they're planning to say you escaped, and they'll probably come after you next." The blood drained from Thomas's face. They were out of time. "When?" he demanded. "When are they moving her?" "After the last bugle call, in less than an hour." The lieutenant looked at Thomas, his eyes pleading. "I can't do anything. Harrison would have me shot. But I can. I can forget to lock your door properly when I leave. And I can tell you the stable master is a heavy sleeper." It was a long shot, a suicidal, insane plan. But it was the only one they had. Thomas had to get to Ayanna before Harrison did. He had to get them both out of the fort. As the last mournful notes of the bugle faded into the night, Thomas pushed open his door. The barracks were quiet. He slipped out into the darkness, a ghost moving through the sleeping fort. The air was cold, and a sliver of moon offered little light. He found the stockade, the small, dark building where they were holding Ayanna. 2 guards stood outside, leaning on their rifles, talking in low voices. He couldn't get past them. He needed a diversion. A big one. He crept toward the stables. The lieutenant was right. A fat sergeant was snoring loudly in a chair just inside the door. Moving with a stealth he hadn't used since the war, Thomas unlatched the gates to half a dozen stalls. He slapped the nearest horse on the rump, and the animal bolted out into the fort, followed by the others. Shouts erupted. Men poured out of the barracks. The guards at the stockade abandoned their post, running toward the chaos of the stampeding horses. It was the opening he needed. He sprinted to the stockade door. It was barred from the outside with a heavy wooden beam. He heaved it off, his muscles screaming in protest, and threw the door open. Ayanna was huddled in the corner of the dark, foul-smelling room. She looked up, her eyes wide with fear, then recognition. "Thomas!" "No time," he said, grabbing her hand. "We have to go. Now." They ran. They dodged through the chaos, staying in the shadows, moving toward the back wall of the fort. Men were yelling, trying to round up the horses. Their diversion wouldn't last long. The stockade wall was 12 feet high, made of sharpened logs. Impossible to climb. But Thomas had noticed something earlier. A supply wagon had been left parked against the wall. If they could get on top of it. He boosted Ayanna up. She scrambled onto the wagon's canvas cover. He followed, pulling himself up just as a shout went up behind them. "There they are! Halt!" A rifle shot cracked through the night air, the bullet splintering the wood next to his head. From the top of the wagon, the top of the wall was just within reach. He leaped, his fingers catching the sharpened point of a log. He gritted his teeth against the pain and pulled himself up. He reached down for Ayanna. She took his hand, and he hauled her up beside him. They were on top of the wall. But on the other side was a 20-foot drop into darkness. "We have to jump," he said. Before she could answer, Captain Harrison appeared at the base of the wall, his face a mask of pure fury in the torchlight. He raised his pistol. "There's nowhere to run, Cowboy!" he screamed. They jumped. They landed hard in a pile of hay that had been left outside the fort walls. The impact knocked the wind out of him, but there was no time for pain. He grabbed Ayanna's hand and pulled her to her feet. They ran, disappearing into the vast, dark wilderness that surrounded the fort. Behind them, he could hear the sounds of the alarm bell ringing, a frantic, clanging proclamation that the hunt had begun. They were fugitives now, alone, unarmed, with a corrupted army at their backs and a hostile frontier in front of them. But as they ran under the cold Montana stars, Ayanna's hand tight in his, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt free. And he knew he would protect this woman, or he would die trying. Because she wasn't just a woman he loved. She was his last best hope for finding his own soul again. The wilderness was both their sanctuary and their enemy. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs felt like lead, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the fort. The sounds of the pursuit faded behind them, but they knew it wasn't over. Harrison was not the kind of man to give up. They found shelter in a rocky overhang as the first light of dawn painted the sky in shades of gray and pink. They were exhausted, bruised from the jump, and had no food, no water, and no weapons. "We can't keep running forever," Ayanna said, her voice a hoarse whisper. "They'll have horses, trackers." "I know," Thomas said. He was looking at the fort in the distance, a tiny smudge against the plains. "Running isn't the answer. We have to fight back." "Fight? With what? We have nothing." "We have the truth," he said. "The young lieutenant who helped me. He's not the only one who knows what Harrison did. There have to be others. Men with a conscience. And your story, Ayanna. If we can get it to the right person, someone above Colonel Davenport, we can stop him." But how? They were fugitives. Every hand would be against them. As they huddled together for warmth, Ayanna suddenly stiffened. "What is it?" he asked. "The cabin," she whispered, her eyes wide with a sudden thought. "The line shack. J.W." "What about it?" "My father's name was John Walker," she said, the words tumbling out. "He was a traitor. But he was more than that. He learned the ways of my people. He hated what the army was doing. He told me he was gathering proof. Letters. Documents. To send to a general in Washington who he said was an honest man. He said he was hiding the proof in a safe place. A place no one would ever think to look." Thomas stared at her, the pieces clicking into place with a sudden, stunning clarity. The overstocked cabin. The strange note. J.W. John Walker. "Your father," he breathed. The cabin was his. "He was trying to expose men like Harrison," Ayanna said, her voice filled with a mixture of grief and pride. "The message. Gone to town. Back in 3 days. He must have gone to deliver his proof. But he never came back." A terrible realization dawned on both of them. John Walker hadn't just disappeared. The war party that had hit the supply wagon. What if it wasn't a random supply wagon? What if it was the one carrying her father? Harrison could have orchestrated the whole thing, Use the Lakota attack as a cover to kill John Walker and steal his evidence. But what if Harrison didn't get it all? What if some of it was still hidden at the cabin? It was a desperate gamble. The cabin was the last place Harrison would expect them to go. He would assume they'd head for the mountains or try to reach another town. Going back to the scene of the crime was insane, which is exactly why it might work. "We have to go back," Thomas said, his mind made up. The journey back to Devil's Canyon was a brutal ordeal. They traveled by night, hiding during the day, surviving on roots and berries Ayanna knew how to find. They saw army patrols in the distance twice, sweeping the plains, and had to hide in gullies, their hearts pounding, until they passed. On the second night, they stumbled upon the grim remains of the supply wagon attack. The wagon was burned, the bodies of the teamsters left where they fell. But as Ayanna searched the wreckage, she found something half buried in the dirt. A small, leather-bound book. A journal. It was her father's. They read it by the faint light of the moon. John Walker's elegant script filled the pages, detailing the corruption he had uncovered. It named names, including Captain Harrison. It spoke of illegal gold prospecting on native land, of treaties being deliberately broken, of rations being sold on the black market. The massacre at Ayanna's village wasn't about revenge. It was a calculated act to clear the land for a secret gold claim Harrison and his cronies had filed. And the final entry was a chilling one. "I believe Harrison knows I have this proof. I am taking it to Three Forks to send with a trusted courier. If I do not return, the rest of the documents are hidden in the line shack, under the second hearthstone, the one that is loose. They had it, the proof, and a map to the rest of it. When they finally reached the ridge overlooking the line shack, their hearts sank. There were horses tethered outside, at least 4 of them. Someone was in the cabin." Thomas crept closer, using the rocks for cover. He peered through the broken window, and what he saw made his blood run cold. It wasn't Harrison's men. It was the Lakota, what was left of the war party. And their leader, Ayanna's cousin, was sitting at the table, staring into the fire. They had come back to the one place of shelter they knew in the canyon. "We can't go in there," Ayanna whispered, her face pale. "He will kill us both." "We have no choice," Thomas said grimly. "The proof is under that floor, and we're not the only ones coming. Harrison's patrols will check this place eventually. It's now or never." He looked at her, at the fear in her eyes. "You told me about a choice," he said. "Between fear and faith. You said your cousin was a good man once. Maybe that man is still in there somewhere. Maybe he'll listen to the truth." It was the longest walk of his life. They stepped out from the rocks, their hands raised, and walked into the clearing. The warriors outside the cabin saw them instantly, and their shouts of alarm brought the others pouring out, weapons raised. Ayanna's cousin stepped out last. His face was a mask of grief and rage. When he saw Ayanna with Thomas, his eyes filled with a terrible, betrayed fire. "Traitor!" he spat, raising his rifle. "You side with the ones who murdered our family." "No!" Ayanna cried out, stepping in front of Thomas. She spoke in her own language, the words flowing like a river, fast and desperate. She told him everything, about her father, about Harrison, about the gold and the lies. She held up the journal. "This is the truth. Our people were not killed for revenge. They were killed for greed, for yellow metal in the ground." Her cousin hesitated, his rifle still aimed at her heart. He was torn. The hate that had consumed him was at war with the memory of the girl he had grown up with. And at that exact moment, a voice rang out from the canyon rim. "Well, well. Look what we have here. A family reunion. Captain Harrison, and a dozen of his soldiers, lined up on the ridge above them, their rifles aimed down at the cabin. He had tracked them. Or perhaps he had known they would come back all along. They were caught. Caught between the Lakota who wanted them dead, and the soldiers who wanted them silenced. The clearing fell into a deadly silence. The Lakota warriors looked from Harrison's men on the ridge to Ayanna and Thomas, confusion and rage warring on their faces. "Kill them all!" Harrison bellowed. "Leave no witnesses!" The soldiers on the ridge raised their rifles. Ayanna's cousin looked at his sister, then at the soldiers, and in his eyes, a terrible understanding dawned. She had been telling the truth. They had all been used. He made a choice. He didn't fire at Thomas. He spun around and fired at the soldiers on the ridge. The canyon erupted into a firestorm. It was a three-way battle from hell. The Lakota, finally understanding who the real enemy was, used their knowledge of the terrain to fight back against the soldiers. Thomas and Ayanna scrambled for cover behind the log wall of the cabin as bullets tore the air around them. Thomas saw his chance. "The Hearthstone!" he yelled to Ayanna over the gunfire. "I'll hold them off!" He grabbed a rifle from a fallen warrior. He wasn't a cowboy anymore. He was a soldier again, fighting a desperate battle in a war he never wanted. He fired at the soldiers on the ridge, providing cover fire as Ayanna darted inside the cabin. He could hear her scrabbling inside, the sound of stone grating on stone. Outside, the battle raged. Ayanna's cousin was fighting like a demon, leading his few remaining warriors in a furious charge against Harrison's men. But they were outnumbered, outgunned. Just as a soldier got a clear shot at him, Ayanna's cousin went down, clutching his chest. His eyes found Ayanna's for a brief second as she emerged from the cabin, a leather pouch in her hand. He gave a small, sad nod, a final apology, before his eyes went vacant. Ayanna screamed his name, a cry of pure anguish. Harrison saw her. He saw the pouch. He started down the rocky slope, his pistol out, his eyes wild with greed and desperation. "That's mine!" he shrieked. He was focused only on Ayanna. He didn't see Thomas aiming the warrior's rifle. Thomas fired. The shot was true. Harrison stumbled, dropping his pistol, a look of pure shock on his face. He clutched at his leg, a dark stain spreading across his trousers, but he wasn't dead. And more soldiers were closing in. It was over. They were surrounded. And then they heard it. A sound that cut through the chaos of the battle. A bugle call, clear and sharp. And from the mouth of the canyon, a new column of riders appeared. More cavalry. At least 30 of them. But these soldiers weren't led by Captain Harrison. They were led by a gray-haired general with cold, intelligent eyes. Colonel Davenport had finally grown a conscience. Or maybe, the lieutenant's story had been confirmed by others. He had sent for his superior officer. The battle was over in minutes. Harrison's remaining men threw down their weapons. The trap had closed, but not on Thomas and Ayanna. It had closed on the man who set it. In the aftermath, as the sun set over the bloody canyon, the general read the documents from the leather pouch. His face grew darker with every page. He looked from the papers to the wounded, snarling Captain Harrison, then to Thomas and Ayanna. "It seems, Mr. McKinnon," the general said, his voice like gravel, "that you and this brave young woman have done the United States Army a great service. You have exposed a rot that goes deep." He turned to Ayanna. "Your father was a good man, miss. His sacrifice will not be in vain. There will be justice." And there was. Harrison and his men were arrested. The conspiracy was unraveled. The fraudulent gold claim was exposed and voided. The story of what happened at Devil's Canyon became a cautionary tale on the frontier. In the end, only 2 of the Lakota warriors survived. They were treated not as hostiles, but as men who had been wronged and were eventually allowed to return to their people, carrying the true story of what had happened. Thomas and Ayanna stood on the ridge overlooking the canyon, the place where it had all begun. The wind was gentle now, carrying the scent of pine and healing. They had walked through the fire and come out the other side. They had lost so much, but they had found each other. "My father wanted to build a bridge," Ayanna said softly, looking out at the vast, beautiful, and dangerous land. "Then let's build one," Thomas said, taking her hand. Together. Their future was as unwritten as the land stretching before them. It wouldn't be easy. The world was still full of hate and fear. But as they turned their backs on Devil's Canyon and walked toward a new horizon, they carried with them something stronger than any army, more valuable than any gold. They carried hope, and they carried the truth of a love that was forged in the heart of the fire, a love that proved even in the darkest of places, a single light could be enough to show the way home. This story is a powerful reminder that heroes can be found in the most unexpected places. If you were in Thomas's shoes, would you have risked it all for a stranger? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of justice on the frontier, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button for more tales from the edge of the unknown.